Chapter 2. Old Friends. The person who had disappeared from the wings of the stage was moving through a dimly lit dome-shaped corridor. People who appeared to be theater staff occasionally passed by, but they also passed by without even looking at the woman, as if she wasn't even there. However, since this was a major backstage artery used by staff involved in hundreds of events, and was sometimes used by tens of thousands of people, it wasn't like everyone knew each other. Of course, there were thorough biometric checks, so there was no room for suspicious people to sneak in, so there was no need to worry if the woman seemed to be a stranger. The large hallway had many branches off of it, making it look like a maze. However, the woman didn't get lost and took a small side passage. At the end of the passage was a nondescript elevator door, and when she placed her hand on the authentication plate next to it, the door promptly opened. As soon as she entered, the doors closed, and the elevator began to descend. After a few seconds, the walls at the back and both ends became transparent, projecting the view outside. The elevator was currently descending through one of the central pillars that ran through reception from the surface to the core unit, offering a panoramic view of each floor. Just being able to see this view would be an event in itself, and the speed at which she descended through this breathtaking scenery made it feel like she was in free fall. Currently, the elevator was under inertial control, so her body did not float up, and there was no discomfort when descending. Because the levels are not simply divided, some of the planet-scale vessels had extraordinary, vaulted structures and levels that could be hundreds of kilometers long. The landscape also had a variety of landscapes, from a completely urbanized level to a level filled with water to a jungle-like level overflowing with nature. Reception was self-sufficient in terms of staff, especially during their long journeys. Naturally, there were food production plants for this purpose, which were also a part of the landscape. Passing through each level, the elevator in which the woman rode descended to an old-fashioned, cluttered, and spliced-together building complex that seemed to be illegally constructed. Although she was wearing an outfit that would be more suitable for a luxury hotel or office, her destination seemed to be that floor, and as the elevator approached the surface of the floor, its speed slowed. The destination was a place that could be considered a ruin, but as she got closer, she could see the many illuminated monitor signs and the hustle and bustle and excitement of the many people passing by, and she realized that it was a livelier place than the previous floors. But that was no surprise, as this floor was where the passionate fans of reception gathered, regardless of age or gender, rich or poor. It was a place that was truly reception-like. The elevator, which had been projecting the view outside, returned to the same opaque wall as before and slowly came to a halt. Even though the door behind her had opened, the woman continued facing the wall inside, as if reluctant to say goodbye to the magnificent view she had just seen. Then she shook off that feeling, turned briskly, and headed out the door. Surprisingly, she emerged into a simple, narrow corridor. It was decorated in chic colors, with only a few subtle elements, and was reasonably neat and clean, unlike the old building outside. The woman walked quickly down the passageway. Of course, it was not just a passageway. There were more than 1,000 different security scans before she reached the end of the corridor, about 10 meters ahead. Passing through all of them without any difficulty, the woman arrived at the final transfer gate. She was then transferred to her final destination with a specially issued pass and biometric identification. Phew. The place she was transferred to was in stark contrast to the simplicity she had felt up until then, with high ceilings and a high-quality interior that resembled a high-end hotel room. "We've been waiting for you." 5 women greeted Kisu with a bow. All of them were wearing clothing similar to the Indian kurta, but each had different designs and colors because they served different masters. They had the air of Jurian warriors rather than maids, and it was clear that they had skills 11 comparable to those of Sito's ladies-in-waiting. Nevertheless, she was familiar with the women, and the atmosphere was friendly. "Thank you." Kisu smiled without reservation and continued to the back of the room. A magnificent relief that served as both a barrier and a gateway, probably inspired by the history of Renza, rattled open in front of her. Passing through the gate and opening a thin curtain, she could hear the hustle and bustle inside. There, a scene unfolded that was a little different from the impression one got from the outside. In front of her were about 10 maids and their upper-class ladies, who were likely their masters, relaxing on sofas. Drinks and snacks were laid out on a wide table, making it seem like a buffet. On the far wall was a surveillance video of various parts of reception, making it truly bizarre. Kisu-sama. Then, the women sitting on the sofa saw Kisu and stood up, running over with big smiles on their faces. All of them seemed to be around Kisu's age. "I am honored to meet you, your royal highnesses." The royal highnesses that Kisu greeted were the legitimate wives of the heads of Renza's 5 royal families. The fact that someone in such a position was present in this remote location, even if it was for camouflage purposes, was indicative of the peculiar nature of reception. "There's no need for formal greetings between us anymore." That's right. Without Sito-sama's support and guidance, we wouldn't be where we are today. The warm and cozy scene reminded her of a reunion of a prestigious women's college being held for the first time in over a decade. However, the women gathered there were undoubtedly the first ladies of Renza. "I never imagined that I would meet you in person so soon. The earliest planned date is still 300 years away." Even though I had received detailed reports and data from Kisu, I honestly couldn't believe that a single person could cause such a phenomenon. She turned her attention to the monitor. For just that moment, their stern gazes offered a glimpse of their true nature. However, looking at the data showing Sena and his team's actions since they came to Renza and the resulting data, it was only natural. Although they couldn't see them from where Kisu was when she entered the room, there were many female operators standing one step lower, making it seem just like a room in an intelligence bureau. The only difference was that everyone was wearing plain clothes instead of uniforms. Oh, looking at this situation, I have no choice but to accept that what happened over there is true. As long as we can't make this data public, no one else is going to believe it. Queen swayed and laughed and breathed a deep sigh. "Yes, I understand your feelings. My girls, Intel team, checked and verified it over and over again, but they still couldn't believe it and even underwent psychiatric evaluations. Unfortunately, the more conscientious a person was, the stronger this tendency was, and they struggled to accept the reality in front of them. However, after the bubble economy hit, Sito's intelligence department was no longer suffering from chronic financial difficulties, and they were able to easily accept this as a fact of life. Same here." The 5 queens turned towards their operators and smirked. Liberta-sama. Kisu was attracted by the expressions of 5 queens' gaze, and as she looked at the operators, she noticed one of them, a woman, and her face contorted in surprise. It was a rare look of shock for Kisu. "It wouldn't be fair if we were the ones being surprised all the time, don't you think?" Seeing this, the queen smiled with satisfaction. "Yeah, well, I'm surprised." Kisu breathed a big sigh and managed to smile. After all, the person sitting in the operator's seat was none other than Dr. Clay's mother. "Oh my goodness, Kisu-chan, I'm glad to hear you're doing well." The beautiful woman who slowly approached with a smile was, contrary to her appearance, over 20,000 years old, just like Clay and Washu. Naturally, she was the oldest woman known to the Galactic Federation at this point. Needless to say, this was a product of Clay's scientific prowess. She was one of the women who possessed the highest level of technology in the Galaxy Academy. "I believe you were developing planetary systems outside of the Alliance's territory, but maybe you've grown tired of it? Well, those kids are strong enough to stand on their own now, so I don't need to keep interfering with them." Well, that's certainly true. Liberta was a genius at finding talented people. After that, she simply pointed out the direction in which those people could bring out their talents, giving them a hands-off approach to development. And she had been successful in all of them. It was only thanks to her that Dr. Clay was able to develop his talent as a philosopher, and the same was true for Kisu's recent border planet development. It was just a result of her raising a child she had a connection with and found intriguing, and it developed into that type of business. Really, this person. Kisu sighed deeply in her heart and ruminated on Liberta's past as if to sort out her feelings. Clay's father was a local lord on a certain planet. His family was an ancient and prestigious family, but with each generation it had fallen into decline, and by the time he inherited it had been transferred to a vast, but deserted and remote territory. Clay's father himself was an ordinary man, and did his best just to maintain the family's status. However, the situation changed drastically when he took Liberta as a concubine. It all started when Clay's father, who was in financial difficulty, asked Liberta's family, a merchant, for a loan. Her family was originally a small merchant house, but had grown rapidly thanks to Liberta's skills, power, and money. Well, that's a common story. The merchant family had many enemies due to their rapid expansion, but they had authority, so they sent Liberta as a concubine to Clay's father, who was having trouble paying off his debts. As a result, Liberta's talent for nurturing was put to good use, and the growth of the next generation of young retainers was particularly remarkable, and eventually their territory expanded to cover the entire continent. Whether this was a good thing or a bad thing depended on one's opinion. However, Liberta had a bad habit. She got bored just when the cultivation was starting to get on track. She didn't rest on her laurels and abandoned the harvest that would have been obtained continuously from the cultivation. As his territory expanded and his power reached its peak, Clay's father had many wives through arranged marriages, and the power struggles were intensifying. Liberta's family, a 14-merchant family, had also grown large enough to form ties with other powerful people, so there was little benefit to having his daughter as Clay's father's wife. So in exchange for giving up the power of her connections, Liberta received a large amount of money, divorced her husband, and left the country, ostensibly in exile. After that, she came to visit her only son, Clay. That's when Neja found out about Liberta. That was intense. Liberta came to see Clay, but he was reluctant, so she dragged him along and happily made the rounds to greet all of Clay's associates, which was the most embarrassing thing she could do for her son. What's more, when Liberta found out Clay's nickname, "Oh, that's not a good name," she said with a smile. The contrast between mother and son at that moment was so stark that even Washu and Neja were unsure of how to react. Of course, the others sympathized with Clay on this matter. Just as we would expect from our mama. She calmly accomplishes things we can't do. There was a fearless idiot who gleefully brought up the topic and teased him, but sure enough, Clay, completely pissed off, unleashed his philosopher's powers and exposed the idiot's embarrassing information, which spread to those around and eventually involved not only those involved, but even unrelated people, escalating into the first great war of embarrassing information exposure. Eventually, professors from the philosophy department were called in to try and calm the situation, but the situation continued to deteriorate as they were unable to stop Clay's obsession, who was raging and had lost all sense of reason, let alone locate him in hiding. Clay was like a man possessed in his quest for revenge, wasn't he? Well, the professors were sympathetic to Clay, and I'm sure they weren't too serious, partly because they were amused. Eventually, everyone was at their wits' end and thought they'd just have to leave Clay alone until he got tired of it. But just as they were about to give up, Liberta, who seemed to be equipped with a special octopus radar, easily captured Clay and dragged him on a pilgrimage of apologies. As a result, Clay was forced to undergo even more humiliation, but fearing the outbreak of a second war of exposure, any talk of Liberta became untouchable at the academy thereafter. Incidentally, the idiot who started it all was quickly exposed, ass and all, and he became mentally ill and shut himself away in his room, which was separated from the rest of the facility. He was then sent back to his hometown in a fresh meat package. Of course, no one felt sorry for him. Fortunately, after that incident, Liberta never showed up at any places related to Clay. However, that didn't mean that Clay's troubles had ended. So, what was Liberta doing? At the time, she was devoting herself to another hobby, collecting art. The funds for this came initially from her own personal funds, but those eventually ran out and she received a donation from Clay. It was not uncommon for the family of a philosopher to depend on the philosopher's income. But in Liberta's case, it was quite extreme, as the amount was half of Clay's earnings. Liberta limited the amount to half and did not ask for more, but it was still a bit excessive for a hobby. I'm sure that was also a factor in Clay's greed for money, and Kisa couldn't help but laugh. The establishment of MMD for philosophy students was also due in part to Liberta's spending. In any case, with Clay's wealth as a backing, Liberta used her abundant funds to buy up art, crafts, and antiques of all genres. It was enough to become the talk of the town in neighboring countries. However, while this may sound like the extravagance of a nouveau riche, Liberta was a gifted woman who recognized Clay's talent, nurtured it, and helped him enter the philosophy department, the highest level of academia at the time. On the surface, the items she bought without regard for authenticity, having been manipulated by many art dealers, were actually just items she recognized as having some value in. Now that I think about it, they were pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Even items by unknown artists or antiques that seemed like nothing more than junk could sometimes become incredibly valuable due to the discovery of new historical facts and changes in values over time. In the case of forgeries and copies, there were cases where the artists who made them were highly regarded, and in some cases, the originals were stolen or lost due to war damage, so the forgeries could become historical materials despite being fakes. Moreover, Liberta's collection history to date spanned about 20,000 years, so there was a solid academic lineage accumulated there. Furthermore, her natural ability, training skills, had influenced the dealers who sold art to her. In the process of searching for products to sell to Liberta, the dealers unconsciously learned her preferences and unknowingly developed their eye for art. As a result, many talents were discovered and nurtured, which contributed greatly to the development of art-related fields. Her name was even included in the art history books of later generations. In addition to her body, which was the culmination of Clay's scientific knowledge, Liberta also possessed another ship. It was a legendary ship that was said to be on par with Jurai's imperial ship and Washu's Ryuoki. Of course, since the concept of the ship was different, it was inferior in terms of simple power and fighting ability, but there was no doubt that it was a masterpiece ship that brought together the best of the philosopher's abilities. Above all, the ship housed a capital city-sized collection of artworks collected by Liberta, which were neatly organized and displayed, and were regularly open to the public. Even without visiting the ship in person, it was possible to view the artworks at any time by linking with a special force field. Although the pieces not on display were not available for loan, precise scan data could be viewed upon request, so the ship eventually came to be known as a museum, and that was now its official name. As a result, it was certain that the ship surpassed all others in terms of its great contributions to both academic and cultural fields. However, this essentially made the value of the treasures stored there public, and so it was inevitable that such a treasure ship, along with its owner, would become a target for thieves to attack. However, Clay's masterpiece ship, the museum, has been able to repel all threats thanks to its incredible security technology and fighting power. As an aside, although Liberta was not as successful as Sena in terms of the number of pirate kills in a short period of time, she was by far the leader in terms of total number. Well, in that respect, she was also contributing to public safety. Now that I think about it, I once had my girls, without revealing their names, look into the data on Liberta's business ventures. The simulation was based on what would happen if Liberta had remained the owner of a company that she had helped develop. As a result, the ladies-in-waiting went to Cito. Can't you somehow scout that person? Please. Please. They even went to Cito in tears with a direct appeal. After all, calculations showed that it would become a conglomerate company larger than Jurai, and Liberta's projected personal assets showed the potential to even support Jurai's military budget, so this was only natural. If only she didn't get so bored, however, that didn't mean all of them were a waste of money. Cito's ladies verified the numbers, and just like with art, her extravagance had contributed greatly to the development and economic revitalization of the Galaxy Federation as a whole. And because of this, the misdeeds of Dr. Clay, who was as outstanding as Washu among the philosophers, were overlooked. By the way, it seems your son is here too. Kisu whispered softly, checking Liberta's expression. Well, for Kisu, It was a bit of revenge for being surprised. It was also the moment she became convinced of the existence of the octopus radar. It seems so. Well, we're not old enough to be parent and child anymore, so it's not like we could meet and talk. But that doesn't mean you've cut ties, right? She still spent half of Clay's earnings every year, and even now she still received technological upgrades for her ship and body. The fact that she had such a strong bond with the greedy Clay was something only a mother and son could do. He still has his original face, doesn't he? He looks a lot like your husband. The husband, of course, was Clay's biological father, whom she had long since divorced and was now deceased. There are probably a lot of people like that depending on the era. Just as common sense and ways of thinking changed with the times and countries, body modification also went in and out of fashion. Some people did not approve of changing the face they inherited from their parents. That child looks just like his father, but that's just a way of spiting me. After all, he loved his father very much. Liberta was smiling broadly. Even the notoriously arrogant philosopher would be no match for his mother, no matter how many thousands of years had passed. Kisu stared at Liberta as if she were a monster. It wasn't every day you saw or heard someone treat Clay like a daddy's boy, and since it was a normal conversation between a mother and son, it was no wonder that Kisu's brain couldn't process it. It seems that what was meant to be a little bit of revenge turned out to be a real disaster. I see. Kisu nodded along to what she was saying, while quickly refueling with some snacks and juice to get her sugar levels up and energize her brain. You've been doing whatever you want here and there for a while now. Don't you think it's time to settle down? Well, yeah, Liberta was definitely plotting something. The fact that she was even here was part of that plan. She was watching the image of Clay and his companion on the monitor. I don't want to know. I don't want to think about it. Don't even think about it. Kisu pushed that fact to the back of her mind. Any further conversation would seriously backfire, and the reason she'd come here in the first place was to exchange information with Renzen Queens, not to perform some dangerous comedy routine with Liberta. Yufufu. However, it seemed to be very popular with the queens who were watching. It's about time. That's right. Now that I've had the chance to say hello to Kisadano, I will be off. Perhaps Liberta had read Kisu's expression, or perhaps she felt that her role of surprising her was over, or perhaps she had simply grown bored, as she waved goodbye to the Renzen queens and hurried to the exit. It was as if they were old friends, and the queens waved goodbye to her with a smile. Although the queens are not the types to show off their authority in this situation, if you thought about it, this was probably the first time Liberta and the Renzen queens met. Even though they knew what kind of position each other held, it was impossible for them to be this comfortable. However, this was Liberta's training skill, her talent for deceiving people. If it will contribute to the future development of Renza, the information shared by the Alliance about the Liberta effect was likely something the Renzen queens were hoping for. There was no harm in becoming friends with her. Now, let's get back to the main topic. With no sign of Liberta around, the entertainment was over for the time being, and although the damage was greater than expected, Kisu had somehow managed to regain her composure. Kisu and the queens sat on the sofa within view of the monitor, and the relaxed atmosphere that had been there until then suddenly changed to one that was more like a summit meeting. Now then, Kisu-sama, first of all, I would like to thank you once again for your assistance to our party. Without your help, and Sita-sama's, our husbands would not have been able to become kings. The five of them all bowed to Kisu at once, and Kisu returned it with a small bow. And this time, the existence of Yamada-sana is accelerating the pace. We are constantly being influenced by it. How pathetic. Yes. As a result, the barriers between us will undoubtedly be removed in the not-too-distant future. But that's too early. Our organization won't be ready yet. Once the Galactic Federation system is in order, I don't think this will have any further impact on us. Various important people were reflected on the monitor. The technology provided by Sito was for intelligence gathering and highly accurate prediction. With the help of Yamada-sana and Washu's schemes, the accuracy had increased even further. The possible outcomes that could be obtained from this were... What do you think Jurai is thinking? Whatever the general opinion of the Galactic Federation, Jurai would have the greatest influence on Renza. The brain tree of the armored cavalry was the backbone of Renza's power, and if Jurai, who possessed higher-level trees, got serious, even the 5 Renzen queens would have almost no political influence. That's where Sito and her old hag club came into play. Here, there were no political or formal concerns, and the women could freely speak their minds. This made it a refuge for those who lost in politics. As I've said before, our final goal is to establish a new alliance, but as you've all said, it is true that the situation is progressing too quickly. In order to balance the power of the Galactic Federation, we are rushing to reorganize our former pirate organizations. Jurai has no intention of becoming a dictator, you say? We don't want to put our precious friends in any kind of trouble. The Imperial family's ships were still subject to many restrictions on their movements. If Renza and Jurai were carelessly linked together, they would end up making the Galactic Federation their enemy. If we just take control of everything, that problem will be solved, right? Those kids hate fighting. But aren't the people of Jurai a warrior race? It's not like we're just going to accept anyone. If they were muscle-brained battle maniacs, they would never have become friends with Tsunami in the first place. Ho ho ho, but your princess is quite something. The Renzen queens turned to the monitor where the Kariko duel scene was being shown. Of course, this was for the purpose of analyzing it from Renza's point of view and coming up with countermeasures, but Kisu was well aware of this and was laughing. It's embarrassing to say, but when it comes to matters concerning Senadano, that's how it goes, to be honest. It was not very praiseworthy that Kariko took out her anger at their ridicule of Sena and challenged them to a duel with the unfamiliar sacred Mechalord in the heat of the moment, as a training exercise. Kisu would have liked for Kariko to respond cleverly as the leader of Sena's army of wives. While the beginning of the battle was poor from a veteran fighter's point of view, Kariko's ability to adjust to and master Washu's peculiar mount in no time with her abundant experience in actual battle and her operative ability was indeed impressive. It was a double whammy. That impulsiveness may also be due to a change from Sena's probability vector. Considering the mission I gave Senadano, those feelings are an important factor. A decoy unit. If the goal was to attract attention and draw the enemy in, Kariko's impulsiveness would act as the driving force that would lead to a resolution. Sena drew them in, and Kariko and the girls would crush them. I wish she'd behave rationally. Kakaka. That is one of the privileges of youth. Isn't it cute? I like it. Even so, things have suddenly become a lot more active around the princess. As they stared at the monitor, they felt a sense of awe at the data and situation displayed there. They were the 5 Renzen queens at the top of the Renza Alliance's political hierarchy. That alone was proof of Sena's extraordinary power. However, while my vision has improved, it is quite difficult to pretend that I don't know anything. Even if they knew that those on their side were enemies, they pretended not to know. It would be one thing if it was just themselves, but sometimes they had to abandon their family and friends to death, even though they could have helped them. But as they were in charge of national politics, they could not lose the advantage of having unilateral information. It may seem tempting to resort to force, but the only way to prevent genocide is to use your strength effectively. Once they started something, they could end up eliminating anyone who seemed even the slightest bit hostile. If they didn't do anything half-heartedly and the enemy became wary, the information would be worthless. If the clear view became cloudy again, it would just be a fight in the dark. That's why we have Senadano. He is exceptionally capable in that regard. Even if the opponent knew a certain amount of information and was wary, he could instantly attract the true nature of his enemy. That was Sena's special power. The reason Kisa came here was to provide them with the know-how to use Sena. That's a pity, though. That's why we're providing them with excellent personnel and equipment. Yes, and I also recommend it for human resource development. You'll be amazed at how much they grow. The troubles that followed were so surprising that the experience gained by those involved with Sena was incredible. In fact, Kariko and her team's combat experience had easily surpassed that of even the most experienced veterans in just a few years. I see. That princess is a good example of that. Yes, we also need to be prepared for a lot of things. In addition to Kariko, other good examples close to Kisu included people like Ringo in the accounting department. While their growth was welcome, it was not uncommon for them to be used as errand boys despite being on the receiving end, and they were often caught out by malicious schemes and made to sit in Saiza. Well, I guess you could say it's a mixed blessing. Ho ho ho, that's an extravagant problem, isn't it? On the monitor was some interesting footage provided by Ringo. It also showed Sito and the others sitting in Saiza position.